It was late August 1944. A gray dawn hung over the rolling fields of northern France, iron silent, heavy, and still smelling faintly of fuel and gunpowder. From a low ridge near Argentan, a German general stood beside the wreckage of his staff car. His uniform, once immaculate, was smeared with dust. The air trembled with the distant hum of engines, not tanks, not aircraft, but something deeper. A mechanical heartbeat rolling through the earth itself. He raised his binoculars, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Across the horizon, stretching farther than the eye could follow, came lines of American convoys, endless columns of trucks, jeeps, tank transporters, ambulances. Miles upon miles of steel in movement, glinting under the pale morning sun. It wasn't an army. It was an empire in motion. Men shouted directions, cranes swung crates of ammunition, gasoline drums rolled, and dust clouds trailed the convoy like the wake of a living storm. The general lowered his binoculars. His jaw tightened. His eyes welled, because in that moment he knew Germany had lost. The war had been decided not on the battlefield, but on the road. To understand that moment, on the ridge, the quiet collapse of a man who had spent years believing in German invincibility, one must return to the beginning of the Industrial War. In 1940, when the German blitzkrieg tore through France in 6 weeks, it looked as though efficiency and precision engineering had conquered the modern world. Panzer divisions moved fast, coordinated by radio and fueled by meticulous planning. German soldiers believed their nation had mastered the art of mechanized warfare. But beneath the surface of that lightning, war was a fragile foundation, one that would not survive the strain of global conflict. By contrast, across the Atlantic, an ocean away from the smoke of Europe, the United States was preparing for something far larger than a battle. It was preparing for production without limits. When Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress in 1940 and declared that America must become the arsenal of democracy, he wasn't making a slogan, he was issuing a blueprint. Within months, assembly lines that once built cars and washing machines began producing tanks, aircraft, trucks, and ships at a pace the world had never seen. By 1942, Ford's Willow Run plant was rolling out a B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. The Detroit tank arsenal could assemble a Sherman tank faster than Germany could repair one. Convoys of Liberty ships carried cargo across the Atlantic in constant rotation, a chain that never broke, even under the threat of U-boats. America was not fighting a war of conquest. It was fighting a war of capacity. Every bolt, every tire, every can of fuel became part of a vast logistical machine. Trains crossed the continent loaded with crates marked overseas only. Soldiers trained beside mountains of supplies they could hardly count. Crates of rations, tents, radio parts, and spare boots stacked to the sky. It was abundance turned into strategy. Meanwhile, in occupied Europe, German officers wrote reports filled with warnings, shortages of oil, damaged bridges, missing spare parts. Their armored divisions were lions running out of breath. By the time Allied troops landed in Normandy in June 1944, America's industrial arm was unstoppable. Over 6 million tons of supplies had been delivered to England in preparation for the invasion. Every bullet fired on the beaches, every tank rolling through the bocage, every soldier eating breakfast that morning, all of it had been planned, packed, and shipped months before the first shot was fired. The Germans didn't see factories. They saw what they thought were armies of men. But what they were truly facing was the power of organization, an invisible force of numbers, fuel, and foresight. When the general on the ridge would later gaze upon the horizon of American convoys, he wasn't just seeing trucks. He was seeing the result of a system so vast, so efficient that even he, a man who had lived through the greatest military machine in Europe, could not comprehend it. It wasn't courage that overwhelmed Germany. It was logistics. And the convoy that stretched beyond the horizon was proof that America had mastered the most important weapon of all, the ability to keep moving forward, no matter how far from home. In the months before that moment, the world had already begun to shift. Allied bombers darkened the skies over German cities. Oil fields were burning. Trains stood idle for lack of coal. German factories could still produce tanks, but not the gasoline to move them. The imbalance was no longer tactical. It was existential, and as 1944 unfolded, that imbalance would break the back of the Reich. By the summer of 1944, Germany was still fighting, but not living. Its armies marched on fumes, its factories trembled under the roar of Allied bombers, and its leaders clung to the illusion that willpower could replace fuel. The once proud Wehrmacht, which had swept across Europe on a tide of precision and momentum, now faced a war it could no longer sustain. The iron had not run out, but the oil had. Every kilometer driven, every shell fired, every tank turned into a logistical debt that the crumbling Reich could no longer repay. In the ruins of Cologne, factories that once built Panzer engines now sat in silence. Their roofs caved in from bombing raids. Coal trains destined for the Eastern Front were being intercepted or destroyed daily. Even Hitler's elite divisions on the Panzer Lehr, the Großdeutschland, rationed gasoline as if it were gold. A single Tiger tank could consume up to 500 liters in a day. Germany had hundreds of them. But what use is steel without fuel to move it? Meanwhile, across the Channel, the scene could not have been more different. In southern England, the hum of engines was constant. Airfields were alive with transport aircraft. Docks overflowed with crates labeled "For France." On every road, American trucks, the legendary 212-ton GMCs, the deuce and a halfs, were rolled by the thousands, each one carrying the heartbeat of the Allied war effort. The numbers defied imagination. Between June and December 1944, over 1.5 million American soldiers, 3 million tons of fuel, and 17 million tons of supplies poured into France. It was an operation of such scale that German intelligence at first refused to believe the reports. The Red Ball Express became its symbol, a non-stop convoy network run mostly by African-American drivers, roaring day and night from Normandy to the front lines. The roads turned black with rubber, and their dust filled the lungs of men who kept the war moving. They faced air raids, accidents, exhaustion, but the convoys never stopped. A captured German officer, when interrogated later, said with disbelief, "You have a railway made of trucks." He wasn't wrong. Every shell fired at German lines was carried on those roads. Every meal, every bandage, every gallon of fuel came through that rolling artery of steel. The Americans had turned war into motion itself. In stark contrast, the Germans fought a war of stillness, rationing, retreating, scavenging. A panzer division might advance one day, only to stop the next, stranded for lack of gasoline. Orders came from Berlin demanding counterattacks that were physically impossible. Even the Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, could barely leave the ground. Generals like Heinz Guderian, the father of Blitzkrieg, watched in despair as his dream of fast warfare choked on empty fuel lines. He knew what he was witnessing, the death of mobility. For soldiers at the front, the difference was visible in everything. American troops had canned food, fresh uniforms, cigarettes, and coffee. German soldiers boiled grass for soup, patched boots with wire, and wrote letters they couldn't send home because the mail trains no longer ran. The psychological collapse began before the physical one. When the general later stood on that ridge in August 1944, watching the convoy move like a river of iron, his tears were not of weakness. They were the tears of a man who understood logistics, who saw that the war had been decided long before the fighting reached him. He realized then that bravery, discipline, and training were powerless against the sheer mathematics of production. For Germany, there was no more fuel to burn. For America, there was no limit to what could be built. And as the horizon filled with engines and flags, the general wasn't just seeing the end of the Reich. He was seeing the future of warfare. The era of the industrial soldier had arrived. The story begins not in Berlin, not in Washington, but on a wind-swept ridge somewhere in northern France. August 1944. A German general, his uniform torn from days of retreat, stands beside a broken field telescope. Below him, the horizon moves. Not the wind, not the clouds, but convoys. Endless American convoys. Trucks upon trucks, tanks chained nose to tail, jeeps darting like ants between steel elephants. The sound alone feels unnatural, a deep mechanical hum like thunder that never stops. He had seen armies before. He had commanded them. But he had never seen this. The road stretching beyond the hills is alive, a metallic river flowing eastward. It glints under the pale French sun. each truck painted with a white star, each one hauling something vital: ammunition, bread, gasoline, men. For hours he watches, through the dust. He can barely make out the insignia. Third Army. Patton's men. The name itself had become a storm on German lips. Every few minutes a line of tanks, Shermans, rumbles by. He notices how effortlessly they move, how quickly they recover from shell craters. Their engines never idle long enough to cool. He hears them shift gear, surge forward, and vanish into the haze. That's when he feels the sting in his eyes. He remembers the briefings from Berlin, the speeches about destiny, the promises of wonder weapons, the jet fighters, the V-rockets, the mythical Tiger IIs that would sweep the Americans back into the sea. But down there are no myths. Only movement. He takes off his cap and wipes his face with a trembling hand. An aide beside him looks away, embarrassed. No one had ever seen the general cry before. "Sir?" the aide murmurs. The general doesn't answer. He lowers the binoculars, eyes fixed on the endless highway. "They will not stop," he whispers. "Even the roads fight for them." He realizes it's over, not because the Americans are braver, not because they have better tactics, but because they have become a machine that cannot be exhausted. War, he now understands, has shifted from courage to capacity. For every tank Germany builds, America builds 10. For every gallon of fuel a German soldier gets, an American gets 50. Even the boots on their feet, the tires on their trucks, the spare engines in their crates, everything screams abundance, and abundance in this war is victory. He thinks back to the early years, Poland, France, Russia, when it was the German engines that filled the fields, when his soldiers were the ones who seemed unstoppable. Back then they were the storm, but now as the sun dips low, he feels what the French and Poles must have felt in 1940. Awe, disbelief, and dread. He grips his map. It's smudged and folded from overuse. The supply routes marked in red have been cut for days. Fuel depots destroyed. Trains ambushed. His tanks, what few remain, are silent hulks hidden in barns, waiting for fuel that will never come. And below, the Americans just keep moving. One convoy passes carrying fuel drums stacked to the sky, each one stamped U.S. Army gasoline. He watches a driver toss a cigarette, laugh with his buddy, then wave to a passing jeep. It looks effortless. That is what breaks the general. He knows his men are dying by the thousands. Brave, starving, sleepless, yet the enemy fights as if war is only an inconvenience, a job to be done before dinner. The scale crushes him more than the fear. He closes his eyes and imagines the factories across the Atlantic, Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, cities he's only seen on maps. He imagines furnaces pouring steel day and night. Ships leaving New York harbors in perfect rhythm. Each convoy below him is not just a column of trucks. It is America itself, crossing an ocean, crossing Europe, crossing history. For a moment he almost smiles. He knows what he is witnessing isn't just defeat, it's the changing of an era. The world will never again belong to those who can fight best, but to those who can supply longest. He whispers something the aide cannot hear. Then, as another thunder of engines rises from the valley, he straightens his uniform, puts on his cap, and turns away. Behind him the convoys stretch on, shimmering into infinity. That night, when the report is written, it says simply, "Enemy logistics beyond comprehension, no countermeasure possible." And though no one ever records it officially, those who were there remember the image. A German general, standing alone on a ridge watching the horizon move, and weeping not from weakness, but from the terrible realization of truth. The German general's despair was not misplaced. What he had witnessed from that ridge in northern France was not merely an army. It was the most sophisticated logistical organism the world had ever seen. To the Americans, logistics was not an afterthought. It was the very heart of their warfare. In the spring of 1944, months before D-Day, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his planners had already mapped not just where the invasion would land, but how it would be fed, fueled and expanded across an entire continent. They knew that victory would not depend on courage alone, but on constant movement. The United States Army called it the Red Ball Express. It was a name painted on signs, maps, and the sides of trucks. and it became the lifeline of liberation. From the beaches of Normandy to the front lines moving east, more than 6,000 trucks roared along makeshift highways that cut through the ruins of France. Each day they hauled thousands of tons of supplies, gasoline, food, ammunition, spare parts, and medical gear. The routes were dangerous, narrow, unpaved, often targeted by Luftwaffe strafing runs, but the drivers kept going. Many of them were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated units, often denied combat roles, yet they became the backbone of the entire Allied advance. They drove through rain, mud, and darkness, headlights blacked out, engines roaring at full throttle. Every 20 miles there was a checkpoint. Every checkpoint, a repair crew, a fuel depot, a field kitchen. The operation was so perfectly synchronized that if one truck broke down, another was already on its way to replace it. In August 1944 alone, the Red Ball Express delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies every single day. To put that in perspective, that's enough fuel and ammunition to sustain 500,000 men in continuous combat. The Germans couldn't comprehend it. Their supply trains, battered by Allied bombers, crawled through shattered rail networks. Their fuel reserves, once filled from Romanian oil fields, had been severed by the Soviet advance and relentless air raids. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed limitless. From Normandy to Paris, from Paris to the Moselle, their supply lines were alive, moving, adapting, rebuilding themselves as fast as the army advanced. When bridges collapsed, engineers threw up pontoon crossings within hours. When depots ran low, Liberty ships unloaded directly onto beaches or river barges. The machine fed itself. Each truck needed gasoline to deliver gasoline. Each tire wore down, delivering new tires. Each driver slept only long enough to deliver a replacement driver. It was a self-sustaining, self-repairing rhythm of war. Behind this miracle of movement stood the American industrial base, an invisible army larger than any battlefield force. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced more than 2.3 million trucks, 600,000 jeeps, 88,000 tanks, and billions of rounds of ammunition. Entire industries pivoted overnight. Car plants in Detroit began forging tank hulls. Typewriter factories produced machine gun parts. Even toy manufacturers made precision instruments for bomb sites. No other nation in history had ever mobilized like this. While the Germans rationed bread and fuel, the Americans exported both. While the Wehrmacht struggled to feed its horses, the U.S. Army fed Europe. One U.S. general later said, "Logistics is what gives strategy its legs." He wasn't exaggerating. The Red Ball Express became a symbol of something deeper, the transformation of warfare itself. In earlier wars, victory belonged to the side that fought hardest, marched farthest, or shot straightest. But in this war, victory belonged to the side that could keep moving without stopping, the side whose supply lines never slept. Every bullet fired by an American rifleman in Belgium, every tank shell launched in the Ardennes, every loaf of bread eaten by a soldier in Rams, all of it existed because a nameless driver kept his truck rolling through the night. By the time autumn came, the German front was collapsing. Not from a single decisive battle, but from exhaustion. The slow, unstoppable suffocation of an army that could no longer move or eat or fight. And across every captured field, every ruined village, the Americans kept arriving, trucks growling, engines steaming, headlights cutting through the fog like searchlights of destiny. To the German general who had stood watching from that ridge, it must have felt like the earth itself had turned against him, a living tide of metal, fuel, and determination that simply refused to end. Because by 1944, America had learned a truth the Germans never fully grasped. In modern war, supply is not support. It is victory. And as the convoys rolled east carrying the weight of an industrial nation, they also carried something invisible, the realization that the war was already decided, not in the trenches but in the factories, foundries, and highways of a distant continent. The horizon had moved, and it was all American steel. By late summer 1944, the Wehrmacht was no longer losing battles. It was starving to death. Every commander in the German army understood what fuel meant to war. A tank without gasoline was a bunker. A truck without diesel was a coffin. And by the time Allied convoys were streaming east across France, the German war machine had become a ghost of its former self, a steel skeleton without blood. The first artery to fail was fuel. The Allied bombing campaign against the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, Germany's primary petroleum source, had begun in 1943. Mid-1944, it was catastrophic. Refinery fires burned so brightly they could be seen from 20 miles away. Entire shipments were lost to Allied submarines and air raids before they even reached the Reich. What fuel remained was reserved for the Luftwaffe and armored divisions. But even there, shortages became desperate. Tank crews were ordered to limit maneuvers. Pilots were grounded for lack of aviation fuel. Officers reported entire divisions immobilized, their vehicles cannibalized for spare parts. A report from General Heinz Guderian's staff in August 1944 summed it up with a brutal simplicity: the Panzer Forces fighting with its last breath. At the same time, the Americans were drowning in abundance. A single division of Patton's Third Army burned through 400,000 gallons of fuel per day, yet the Red Ball Express delivered it without pause. Massive fuel depots sprang up across France, each one a small city of stacked drums and pipelines. Engineers built Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, stretching from England to Normandy, pumping millions of gallons of gasoline straight to the front. For every German tank idling in silence, 10 American Shermans thundered forward. Fuel was only part of the story. The second artery was food. By 1944, the German home front was collapsing under hunger. Bread was rationed. Meat nearly vanished. Soldiers on the Western Front often survived on captured Allied rations or whatever they could forage. In occupied France, requisitioning and looting had stripped villages bare. In contrast, American soldiers ate like no army before them. Each man received a balanced, calorie-rich diet: canned meats, chocolate bars, powdered eggs, and even cigarettes in every ration pack. The now famous K-ration was designed to provide full nutrition for a soldier on the move. Field kitchens followed every unit, baking fresh bread daily. To the Germans, captured American food was a revelation. It tasted of something they hadn't known in years: normal life. Prisoners of war often commented not on the shock of capture, but on the shock of being fed. One German officer, captured in the Ardennes, reportedly said, "I have not eaten like this since before the war. Even our generals do not eat like your privates." That wasn't arrogance, it was disbelief. The Americans' ability to feed millions while fighting across a continent was as devastating as their tanks and guns. It wasn't just morale, it was momentum. A hungry army slows, a fed army moves, and the German army was starving. Fuel, food, and finally, fear. Fear crept through the ranks of even the most hardened German soldiers. Not just fear of Allied firepower, but fear of the endlessness of it all. They began to whisper that America was an engine that could not be destroyed. That no matter how many tanks they burned, how many depots they bombed, more would appear inexhaustible, inevitable. In September 1944, when German scouts reported a single American supply column stretching nearly 70 miles across France, a staff officer in the 7th Army simply said, "If that report is true, the war is already lost." It was true. American logistics were not a line, they were a flood. A continent's worth of factories, farms, and freight lines focused on one goal: feed the machine that fed itself. And every time a German soldier stared across a field and saw another wave of Sherman tanks, another sky full of thunderbolts, another convoy on the horizon, he wasn't just seeing the enemy. He was seeing proof that his own nation's lungs had stopped breathing. The Wehrmacht had once believed itself invincible, precise, disciplined, unstoppable. But precision meant nothing when the tank behind you had no fuel, the soldier beside you no bread, and the road ahead no hope. In the end, it wasn't superior weapons or courage that won the Western Front. It was supply, the quiet, relentless power of trucks, trains, and men who never stopped driving. As the Americans advanced toward the German border, the enemy's war machine collapsed not in a final blaze but in slow motion, starving, empty, broken. And the German general who once watched the convoys from that ridge had been right all along. They would not stop. Before the first shot was fired in Normandy, before the first American tank rolled across France, an army of engineers was already fighting a different kind of war. One made not of bullets but of bridges, bulldozers, and blueprints. They were the unsung soldiers of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, men who built victory mile by mile. Their battlefield was the map itself. Every road, every river, every demolished bridge had to be conquered with steel and timber before any soldier could advance. In 1944, as the Allies broke out from Normandy, the terrain of France became a tangled mess of wrecked towns, cratered highways, and bombed-out bridges. To most armies, that would have meant delay. To the Americans, it meant opportunity. Within hours of entering a destroyed village, engineer battalions were already at work, cutting away rubble, laying temporary roads, rebuilding bridges strong enough to carry 30-ton Shermans. They worked in shifts so relentless that locals joked the roads rebuilt themselves overnight. One of their most astonishing feats came in August 1944, when engineers rebuilt the bridge at Montesgassicourt over the Seine River. Under sniper fire, with explosions echoing across the banks, they assembled a floating pontoon bridge nearly 200 feet long in just 14 hours. By dawn, tanks were crossing. It was that speed, that mechanical rhythm, that made the American advance unstoppable. Every bridge was a pulse, every road a vein, and the engineers were the beating heart. But their greatest challenge was still to come: keeping up with Patton. George S. Patton's Third Army advanced faster than any force in modern history up to that point. His tanks burned through 500,000 gallons of fuel a day, his divisions outrunning their own supply lines. And when Patton's spearhead reached the Moselle River, engineers once again found themselves at the edge of the impossible. The Germans had blown every crossing. The riverbanks were steep, the currents fierce, the enemy entrenched on the far side. But the engineers went to work anyway, often waist-deep in freezing water, building bridges under artillery fire. One lieutenant later said, "We didn't wait for orders. We built until someone told us to stop, and nobody ever did." They lashed together pontoon sections under tracer fire. They drove steel pilings into mud while shells exploded yards away. They guided tanks across trembling temporary bridges that groaned under the weight, and somehow held. By morning, the entire Third Army was across. The Germans could hardly believe it. To them, rivers had always been natural defenses, barriers that could buy time. But to the Americans, there was no such thing as an obstacle, only another engineering problem to solve. Behind the lines, construction battalions built massive depots, some larger than cities. The Chartres depot covered over 2,000 acres, storing millions of gallons of fuel, thousands of tons of ammunition, and enough food to feed 2 armies. And wherever the Americans went, they brought order out of destruction. Railway engineers restored bombed French lines in record time, allowing trains to run supplies straight to the front. Communication units laid thousands of miles of cable, ensuring that every division could talk, move, and strike in unison. The result was what military historians later called the most efficient logistical network in human history. German intelligence reports read like notes of disbelief. Enemy construction and repair capabilities are beyond our capacity to disrupt. Even when the Germans managed to destroy bridges, the Americans were already rebuilding them. When they mined roads, the engineers cleared them overnight. It was a war fought with wrenches as much as rifles. Every plank nailed, every beam lifted, every bridge raised under fire. It all carried the same weight as artillery. Because without those bridges, no tanks would have crossed, no fuel would have flowed, no victory would have been possible. And in that relentless work, in the sound of hammers striking steel beside the rumble of tanks, the war found its rhythm. The engineers didn't seek glory. They didn't make headlines. But every convoy that stretched beyond the horizon, every tank that rolled through the mud of France, every supply truck that reached the front, all of it was built on their sweat, their precision, their courage. The German general who once stared at that unending line of American vehicles might not have known their names. But it was their bridges that carried those convoys, their roads that reached his horizon, and as the Allied war machine rolled deeper into Europe, it did so on pathways that had been built by men who never stopped moving forward, even when the earth itself was against them. By September 1944, The horizon that once shimmered with American convoys now pressed against the dark wall of Germany itself, the Siegfried Line. It was supposed to be impenetrable, a fortress of concrete, steel and earth stretching over 390 miles along the western border of the Reich. Bunkers, dragon's teeth, minefields, and pillboxes, all built to halt whatever remained of the Allied advance. To the German High Command, this was their last line of defense. To the exhausted American soldiers who reached it, it looked like the end of the world. But behind them, that same horizon still moved. Convoys, bulldozers, pontoon bridges, trucks, tanks. The machine hadn't stopped. Patton's Third Army and Hodges's First Army now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to strike the dragon in its den. And though the Germans fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland, their strength was bleeding away. Fuel shortages crippled every movement. Units fought without air cover. Commanders rationed artillery shells to a few rounds per gun per day. Even the mighty panzer divisions had become shadows, tanks without gas, armor without mobility. Meanwhile, the Americans had learned to fight a war of momentum. They didn't wait. On September 12, 1944, near the town of Aachen, the first American units encountered the Siegfried Line's bunkers, thick concrete walls. Gun ports like eyes of stone. Rain soaked the fields. Smoke hung over the ridges. From every pillbox came the thunder of MG-42 machine guns, cutting through infantry ranks like a scythe. For hours, progress was measured in yards. Then came the engineers. They crawled forward with satchel charges and flamethrowers, their uniforms slick with mud. Bulldozers followed behind, pushing through minefields, filling tank traps, and carving narrow lanes for the Shermans. Every advance was a test of endurance, every explosion a contest between concrete and will. By nightfall, the first breach was made. Sherman tanks rolled through gaps where bunkers had once stood. Behind them, waves of infantry stormed the trenches, clearing them bunker by bunker. The Germans fought fiercely. Many refused to surrender, fighting until their positions were obliterated by direct tank fire. But the Americans didn't stop. Their momentum, the same relentless rhythm of fuel and supply, was now unstoppable. Every day, thousands of tons of ammunition poured into the line. Every hour, wounded men were replaced by fresh ones. The machine fed the front like a living organism. When one division ran low on shells, another convoy arrived before dawn. When tanks burned out their engines, mechanics replaced them within hours. The Germans, by contrast, had begun to fight on empty. In one report from the 7th Army near Aachen, a commander wrote, "We have courage, but no means to use it." The Americans pushed harder. In early October, the fighting reached Aachen itself, the first major German city to face capture. Hitler declared it a fortress, ordering it to be held at all costs. The city became a maze of shattered buildings, collapsing walls, and street-to-street combat. American infantry advanced under constant fire, every block contested, every hour bought with blood. But once again, supply decided fate. Each day, artillery pounded the city with thousands of shells. Each night, convoys brought more. Fuel for tanks, food for troops, replacement parts, and reinforcements arrived in an unbroken stream. German officers inside Aachen radioed for help, but no help came. Their supplies had vanished. Their reinforcements were trapped behind bombed rail lines. By October 21st, the white flags appeared. Aachen fell. For the first time since the war began, a German city had been taken by an enemy army. And it wasn't just a military defeat, it was psychological collapse. Inside the Reich, propaganda had promised that the Siegfried Line was unbreakable. But it had broken, not from lack of courage, but from starvation, exhaustion, and the sheer industrial tide that the Americans carried with them. One German officer later wrote in his diary, "We did not lose Aachen in battle. We lost it in the factories of Detroit. From the rubble of that city, the Americans could now see beyond the horizon, into Germany itself, into the heart of the enemy that had once threatened the world. And though the winter to come would be brutal, though names like Hürtgen and Bastogne still waited, the balance had already shifted. The unstoppable tide of convoys, the engineering miracles, the endless supply of fuel and food, They had done what no weapon could. They had broken the myth of German invincibility. The Siegfried Line had been more than a wall of concrete. It was the symbol of Nazi defiance, the edge of Hitler's empire, and now it was cracked open by the same power that had made a German general weep months before on that ridge in France, an enemy that never ran out. The fall of Aachen had sent a tremor through the German high command, not because of the city's size, but because of what it meant. The enemy was now inside the fatherland. Winter descended early that year. By November 1944, the roads of Western Germany had turned to rivers of mud. Rain soaked everything. Visibility was low. Engines coughed black smoke. The American advance slowed, but it did not stop. Convoys still crawled through the darkness, headlights blacked out, their engines echoing across ruined valleys. Fuel trucks became the arteries of the front, grinding through the muck to keep Patton's and Hodge's men alive. Behind every shell fired, every jeep that moved was the machine, still breathing, still feeding itself. Yet for the Germans, desperation had hardened into madness. In December 1944, Hitler launched his final gamble, Operation Wacht am Rhein, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. It was meant to divide the Allied armies, seize Antwerp and force a peace on German terms. The plan relied on one illusion, that the Americans were tired, stretched thin, and vulnerable. They weren't. When the first snow fell over the Ardennes forest, German panzers emerged from the mist like ghosts from an older war. Columns of Tiger and Panther tanks punched through thin American lines near the Belgian border. Overwhelming units of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions. For a brief moment, the impossible seemed to happen. The Americans were pushed back. Towns like St. Vith and Clairvaux fell. Thousands were surrounded, but beneath the chaos, the same machine that had carried America across France began to turn once more. Logistics, the quiet, relentless heart of the Allied war effort, responded like a living reflex. Fuel convoys were rerouted within hours. Ammunition trains diverted. Reserve divisions pulled from rest camps and moved toward the Ardennes overnight. Engineers worked through blizzards, repairing bridges and carving frozen roads for tanks. Patton, commanding the Third Army to the south, performed one of the most astonishing maneuvers in military history. Within 72 hours, he pivoted his entire army, 250,000 men, northward through sleet and snow to strike the Germans' exposed flank. It was only possible because of supply. Fuel depots had been placed with foresight months earlier. Road networks had been mapped. Trucks already loaded were rolling even before orders were finalized. Every division that moved did so because someone, somewhere had planned it weeks before and down to the last gallon of gasoline. The Germans, by contrast, were burning through their final reserves. Their tanks ran on captured American fuel. When those ran dry, they were abandoned in the snow. The deeper they advanced, the more they starved. American fighter bombers soon returned when the weather cleared, slicing through the fog and cutting German columns to pieces. Panzers that had crawled forward on borrowed fuel now burned in white fire against the frozen landscape. By Christmas Eve, the German spearhead, once a sharp thrust into the Allied line, had dulled into exhaustion. The town of Bastogne became the focal point. Surrounded, freezing, and battered by artillery, the 101st Airborne Division held its ground. Supplies were airdropped through blizzards. Pilots risked their lives flying low between bursts of anti-air fire to deliver ammunition, food, and medicine. Each crate that hit the snow meant another hour of resistance. The Germans demanded surrender. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe's reply became legend. Nuts. It was more than defiance, it was faith in the machine. The 101st knew the convoys were coming. They trusted that somewhere beyond the horizon, America was already moving toward them. They were right. Patton's tanks reached Bastogne on December 26th. The siege broke. In the snow-choked forests of the Ardennes, the tide of war turned once again. Not because the Americans were more fearless, but because they were never alone. Every soldier at the front was carried by millions behind him. Engineers, truck drivers, mechanics, factory workers, farmers. The German dream of halting the American advance died there, buried beneath the snow. When the smoke cleared, more than 80,000 German soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The last reserves of the Wehrmacht, their final gamble, were gone. From that point on, the Reich was fighting only to delay the inevitable. One German officer, captured near the Meuse River, said in disbelief, "Even in our victory, they fought like they could not lose. Every time we struck, their columns kept arriving. It was like fighting an empire that never slept." By January 1945, the roads once again filled with American convoys, thousands of trucks crawling through ice and fog. Heading east toward the Rhine, they carried more than supplies. They carried certainty. The same German general who had once wept in France would hear, months later, the roar of those engines once again, now echoing across his homeland. And he would know the truth with painful clarity. The Americans had not simply invaded a country. They had engineered a new kind of war. A war fought not just with courage, but with connection, every man, every machine, every mile working in perfect rhythm. The winter of 1944 had been meant to break them. Instead, it proved that they could not be broken. By February 1945, Germany was no longer a nation of soldiers. It was a nation of survivors. Cities burned from the inside out. Rail lines were torn to ash. Bridges lay in rivers like the bones of a dead animal, but the Americans were still coming. Through Belgium, through Luxembourg, through the shattered woods of the Hurtgen forest, the machine rolled forward. The convoy stretched for hundreds of miles, feeding the fire of an army that no longer paused between battles. Each day, 18,000 trucks crossed into Germany. They brought with them food, ammunition, spare parts, even hot coffee for soldiers who hadn't seen a home in years. The German front, what remained of it, was collapsing under its own silence. Communication had disintegrated. Fuel was gone. Commanders were forced to burn maps for heat. The Wehrmacht, once the most formidable military force in Europe, had become a ghost. Its divisions existed on paper, but in the mud and rubble of Western Germany, they were just men walking home with empty rifles. And behind every broken German position came the same sight. The roads filled with olive-drab vehicles, headlights glinting in the cold, Shermans, half-tracks, convoy trucks, field kitchens, fuel carriers. They moved like a tide, sweeping across a continent that no longer had the strength to resist. For the German general who had once watched these convoys from afar, the sound had become unbearable, a metallic thunder that announced the death of the old world. He had believed in victory once. Believed in steel, in discipline, in the genius of strategy. But this was something different. Something his generation had never prepared for. This was industrial warfare at its purest form. The Americans didn't win by numbers alone. They won because they could move. Because they could replace what they lost faster than the enemy could destroy it. Every tank destroyed was replaced by another, shipped across the Atlantic, unloaded at Cherbourg, and driven east within days. Every plane shot down was rebuilt in factories that never slept. Every soldier fed by farms that stretched across an ocean. The Reich could not compete with that. Its people were starving. Its soldiers marched on foot while their enemies rolled on rubber and steel. Its factories, once proud, were now smoking craters. When the Americans crossed the Rhine at Remagen in March 1945, it wasn't just a tactical victory. It was a symbol. The Ludendorff Bridge, half destroyed but still standing, became the artery through which the Allied armies poured into the heart of Germany. Engineers worked under fire to repair it. Convoys thundered across day and night, their engines echoing down the riverbanks like the footsteps of fate. German general, now retreating, with what remained of his command, watched from a distance as the bridge lights shimmered against the water. He turned to his aide and said quietly, "We built fortresses to hold them. They built roads to move around us." That sentence captured the truth of the war's end. The Germans had built a military to fight battles. The Americans had built a system to win wars. Factories in Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago had done more to defeat the Reich than any single battlefield. The Liberty ships that crossed the Atlantic every day, everyone launching every 8 hours at the peak of production, had carried the weight of an entire civilization on their steel decks. Even the average American soldier had more resources than most German units. He ate better, slept warmer, and carried more ammunition. His radio worked. His rifle was cleaned. His rations arrived on time. It wasn't luck. It was design. By the spring of 1945. The Red Ball Express and the legendary highway, system of supply that had once carried the war through France, had transformed into a direct route of conquest. Every mile driven was another nail in the coffin of the Third Reich. The German general wrote in his final field diary entry before surrendering, "They fought with engines, not with men. Our courage died trying to catch up." In April, as American and Soviet forces converged on the Elbe River, the horizon filled once again with convoys, those same endless lines that had first broken his spirit months before. Except now, they were not distant anymore. They were inside Germany, inside the empire he had sworn to defend. The hum of engines filled the air from sunrise to sunset, a sound that no German soldier would ever forget. And when the end finally came, when Hitler was dead and Berlin had fallen, the silence that followed felt unreal. The roads, once alive with steel, now stretched empty through the ruins. But the legacy of what they had carried, the power of movement, of industry, of an unstoppable will, would outlive every fortress and every flag. The war had proven one thing above all: victory doesn't belong to the side that fights the hardest. It belongs to the side that never runs out of motion. It was May 1945. The guns had gone quiet. Across Germany, the air hung heavy, not with smoke anymore, but with the weight of realization. In a small field near Kassel, a convoy came to a stop. Dozens of American trucks lined the road, engines ticking in the cool evening air. Soldiers sat on their hoods, smoking in silence, staring at the horizon that only weeks ago had been enemy territory. Beyond the fields, columns of German prisoners marched west, tired, hungry, but alive. Among them walked the general who, months earlier, had stood on a ridge and watched those same convoys stretch to infinity. He had commanded armored divisions in France, fought through snow and mud, and believed, or as many of his generation had, that discipline and brilliance could overcome any enemy. But now, with his hands clasped behind his back and his boots worn thin, he saw the truth more clearly than ever before. He stopped for a moment and turned toward the distant road. Another convoy was moving east, trucks full of supplies for the occupation forces, their headlights glimmering like a trail of stars across the darkening countryside. The sight brought a strange stillness to him. Those endless American columns, once symbols of dread, now seemed almost beautiful in their rhythm. Each engine represented not just power, but order, not conquest, but purpose. The general realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Wars are not won by the loudest guns or the boldest maneuvers. They are won by the side that can keep going when everything else falls apart. He thought back to his own supply trains, the ones that had vanished under Allied bombers, the fuel depots that had burned, the endless orders to retreat. He remembered the faces of his men, brave, loyal, starving. And then he remembered the sound and that low, distant thunder of engines that had haunted him for months. It was the sound of inevitability. When he later wrote his memoirs in captivity, he described that moment in a single line. "The war was lost not when we were defeated in battle, but when I saw their convoys stretch beyond the horizon." He wasn't exaggerating. That single image, the endless line of American vehicles carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and hope, captured the transformation of modern warfare. It was no longer about courage in the field. It was about power in motion, industry in service of endurance. The German general had seen it with his own eyes, an army that could rebuild itself every day, and across the Atlantic. In American cities that had never heard a bomb fall, workers returned home from the night shift, wiping grease from their hands. They had never fired a gun, never crossed the ocean, yet they were the architects of victory. Every factory whistle, every assembly line, every convoy that crossed Europe was a quiet declaration of what America had become, the arsenal of democracy. When the general reached the prisoner camp that evening, he was given a tin cup of hot coffee by an American soldier, strong, bitter, steaming in the cool air. He stared at it for a long time before taking a sip. And in that moment, he felt the smallest flicker of peace. not because he accepted defeat, but because for the first time he understood it. The horizon he had once feared was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a world rebuilt by those who could move, build and feed faster than war itself could destroy. The convoys would keep rolling for years to come, carrying relief instead of shells, food instead of fuel, hope instead of fear. The same engines that had broken an empire were now carrying supplies to rebuild it, and somewhere in the hum of those engines, steady, patient, unstoppable, lay the quiet heartbeat of a new world. In the end, the war was not only a contest of courage, it was a test of endurance. The German general's tears on that distant ridge were not simply for the defeat of his army, but for the death of an idea, the belief that brilliance and valor alone could overcome the machinery of modern war. What he witnessed was something deeper, the industrialization of willpower. The American convoys that rolled across Europe were not glamorous. They did not roar like fighter planes or thunder like artillery. They simply moved endlessly, efficiently, and without hesitation, and in that motion lay their power. Each truck, each crate, each gallon of fuel represented the invisible thread that connected a farm in Kansas to a battlefield in the Ardennes. It was the physical manifestation of a nation's unity, a system where every hand, from the factory worker to the frontline soldier, turned in the same direction. Wars throughout history had been fought for land, for kings, for ideas. But World War II proved something new, that the side with the stronger engine, the better road, and the fuller warehouse would always outlast the side with sharper tactics. The German general's realization still echoes through the doctrines of every army today. Logistics became not the background of war, but its foundation. The silent art that decides whether a soldier eats, fights, or falls. When those convoys stretched beyond the horizon, they carried more than supplies. They carried the future of warfare. The future of nations built on production, not destruction. The future of a world that learned through fire and hunger that victory is not a matter of pride, it is a matter of preparation. For the Americans, that lesson became legacy. For the Germans, it became memory, and for history, it became proof that the strength of a nation is not measured by the size of its armies, but by the distance its convoys can travel, and by the horizon they can reach before they stop.